Hello and welcome back to Voyage of a Time Wanderer. Today I'm going to be sharing my Victober 2020 wrap-up. So as always, I'm very grateful to Katie from Books and Things, Kate Howe, and Lucy the Reader for hosting Victober. I had another wonderful month immersing myself in Victorian literature. I read 9 books in October. 5 of these were directly Victober related and 2 were Victober adjacent, I'll call it. So I really enjoyed myself and I'm looking forward to sharing what I read. So the first book I read this Victober was The Englishwoman in Egypt by Sophia Poole. And this is a collection of letters that I read for the journal diary / letters prompt. So this is a collection of letters that Sophia wrote while she was living in Egypt in the 1840s, following her breakdown in her marriage. Her brother, who was an Egyptologist, archaeologist at the time, invited her and her 2 young sons to come stay with him in Egypt. So I believe they lived there from 1841 to 1849. But this collection of letters is really focusing on the first 2 years or so of their time there. The one thing I did find a little bit disappointing was that it seemed like this collection of letters was really written with the intent to publish in mind when they were written. When I selected this, I actually kind of misread it and I thought that this was a collection of letters that she'd written back to her brother, not that this was a collection of letters written while she was living with her brother. So I was thinking that it was going to be written like maybe back to a family member or a friend, and then they would have decided at some point, maybe after she died, that this was an interesting story to tell and published it that way. But instead it seems like she wrote all these letters back to a publishing company at the time, some kind of magazine, and that she wrote them knowing that they were going to be published. So it wasn't really as authentic or raw of a view into her life as I was expecting. I thought that it would be maybe a bit more personal, but you could tell that she was really writing these knowing that people were going to read them and purposely putting different scenarios and situations in that she thought would illustrate her point about what Egyptian society was like. So they do read very much as like a non-fiction textbook account of life in Egypt rather than telling little anecdotes and stories about her time there. So in that way it was a little bit drier than I was expecting, and it was a bit more sanitized, I guess. I thought it would be more personal. But it was still very interesting to read. It's definitely an insight into what English people were thinking when they moved to Egypt at the time, how they saw Egyptian society, the things that surprised them and shocked them about the way that culture was living. It was also a very interesting exemplar of how English colonialists thought and acted at the time. You can definitely see a lot of colonial mindsets at play in this novel. And it was interesting to read this at the same time as my first Victorian adjacent book, which was the first Amelia Peabody mystery, The Crocodile and the Sandbank. So it was very fascinating actually to read the 2 at the same time, to see the similarities between the 2 stories. I don't know if this is one of the sources that the Amelia Peabody author relied on when drafting her novel, but some of the passages were really similar, especially to do with pyramid exploration, like in both Sophia Lane's book and then in the Amelia Peabody mystery. It seems like at the time you just had free reign to go inside pyramids anytime you wanted, to climb up on top of them, to examine ancient artifacts on your own. So that was definitely a neat connection to make reading the 2 at the same time, because there were some sections relating to archaeology, relating to Nile river boats, for example, that were very, very similar. So it did definitely make me think that the Amelia Peabody series are accurate and a well-written portrayal of life in the time period. So I'm glad I read The Englishwoman in Egypt. I wouldn't seek out more of her work. I would never reread it, but it was an interesting little insight of nonfiction into English colonialism in North Africa in the Victorian period. So the second book that I finished in October was A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, and this was definitely my standout favorite of the month. I absolutely adored this book, and I think that this is my favorite Dickens so far, which I know is a bold claim, but Tale of Two Cities is really something special. I found this book moving, emotional, and haunting. It's definitely one that I still think about routinely, and I think it's going to be one that sticks with me for a long time. Having just visited Paris in February this year, right before the world went into lockdown, it was so cool to be able to picture exactly the different places and situations that they were describing in the book. So when, they're having their trial at the conciergerie, I was there. I saw the cells that they kept people in the conciergerie. I saw the courtroom area. I saw the path that they would have walked in and out. Like, I saw the courtyard where they would, prisoners would arrive and be taken off to the guillotine. I also had visited the catacombs when I was in Paris, so I saw firsthand the amount of carnage and death that Paris experienced at the time. This is a little bit graphic, but some of the skulls, you could tell the difference between people who died naturally and people who died from the guillotine based on the way the skulls looked in the catacombs. So it was definitely something that brought this story to life. I could really picture exactly the places that the characters in the story was unfolding. I do feel a little bit bad saying that this is my favorite Dickens, because I feel like part of the reason I like this book so much is that it's a bit different than the typical Dickens. So I read this for the read a book of your favorite modern genre in the Victorian era prompt. So this is historical fiction, so that right away is different than a lot of the other books written by Dickens. I haven't read any other French Revolution literature. You can see I have a big Les Mis that I bought in Paris on my bookshelf, and I'm planning to get to that next year. But I hadn't already read Les Mis, which I think maybe had an impact on how I viewed this book. So I'm definitely interested in reading Les Mis now and comparing the approach taken. Obviously, A Tale of Two Cities is written in a way that is somewhat sympathetic to the aristocratic side, since the main characters that we're rooting for are former French aristocrats who have renounced their claim and then still get embroiled in the violence. Having said that, I've seen a lot of reviews saying that Madame Defarge is like one of Dickens' most haunting villains, and although I understand why she's characterized as a villain, I didn't find her that villainous. I did find that he developed the story in a way that you are very sympathetic of the reasons why she's behaving the way she's behaving, and that it was fairly well balanced in its portrayal of the reasoning on both sides, of both the aristocrats and the workers who are rising up. Another way that it's different than a lot of other Dickens that I've read so far is that the cast of characters is quite a bit smaller. You're really only following this one family and their experiences. There are still multiple points of view, but most of the storylines kind of are directly interacting with each other quite early on, whereas in some Dickens novels, it's, some of these characters you don't even see how they're going to be relevant into the plot until quite a bit further on. So I think that helped in making the book shorter and easier to understand. I did listen to this on audio, which maybe helped, but I did really blast through this book quite quickly, and I think part of that was helped by the fact that the storyline felt a lot tighter, I guess, than a lot of other Dickens books. So I really, really enjoyed this. I highly recommend it. I'm tempted to do a full video review and share some pictures from my time in Paris, so if that's something that would interest you, let me know. But if you haven't read A Tale of Two Cities and you enjoy historical fiction and you like Dickens but sometimes find his complex character webs a little bit difficult to follow, I think A Tale of Two Cities might be the book for you. So next I read two poetry collections by Meta Orred. The first is her first poetry collection, it's just called Poems, and then the second is called Ave Lamina Mia, which is actually one of the poems from Poems taken and expanded upon. So when I was reading through Poems, the longest poem in there is about 40 pages, and I realized that the title looked really familiar from when I'd been researching Meta Orred, and sure enough, that was the poem that she took and expanded into being about 90 pages. So I read both the expanded version and counted that as a book, and then I finished the original poetry collection as well and counted that as another. I did really enjoy these poems. I haven't read a lot of Victorian poetry, so I'm not sure if the themes that she was analyzing are common across Victorian era poetry, if this was kind of the main themes that were being analyzed at the time, or if it was unique to her poetry. But most of these poems were either based on the Greek myths. I'm pretty sure the whole first third were all kind of Greek myth retellings in poetry form, and then some of them had Christian religious themes, and then probably the last half of the book was dealing with themes around death. So I tried to research more about the author because I'm not sure if she had a personal tragedy. Some of them are really quite sad and depressing, and I'm not sure if that was based on her own life experience or if that was something that was a common theme in Victorian poetry. But I did really enjoy them. There's a few that I would say are favorites that I'd go back to, and I would definitely plan to read more of her poetry if I can find them. When I tried to research into her life, there didn't seem to be a lot out there on the internet. Most of the websites that mention her or her Wikipedia page are about 2 sentences that just say, Meta Orred wrote these poetry collections. It is thought she was born on this day and died on this day, and that's pretty much it for the information out there on her. So I'm really curious whether, you know, she had a husband or a fiance that passed away or a child that passed away. So I think I'm going to have to dig a little bit more into her personal life and maybe use some of my genealogy skills to see what I can track down about her, because she definitely can write some beautiful poems. And I'd be interested in knowing more about where she got inspiration for her writing. Then the other Victorian adjacent reading that I did was a short story, and that is The Masque of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. So obviously this is Victorian adjacent because it was written in the same time period as Victorian literature, but he was an American author, so doesn't really count as Victorian, I don't think. But this was a short story that I had really wanted to read because it deals with a plague that is attacking a country, and the richest people in the country lock themselves up in a big castle to try to forget about the plague and have a giant festival celebration party while ignoring the suffering that is happening in the rest of the country. And I don't know if this is a spoiler or not, but they can't escape the Red Death, and it arrives at their party, and you know, that's where the story unfolds. So I thought, I had seen some people talking about this. Obviously it's very relevant to current events, and I'm glad to have read it. If I was an English teacher right now teaching maybe 10th grade English, this is definitely a short story that I would be making people read and analyze and compare to events that are happening right now. So I'm glad I read it. It's kind of Victorian adjacent, being that it was written in the same time period, but in a different country. And the last book that I actually finished for Victober was Shirley by Charlotte Bronte. This was the group read, and I'm very happy that I finished it because it was definitely a slow slog for me at the beginning. If this hadn't been the group read, I would have DNF'd it probably 5 times in the first third or so. I found the first third quite slow, quite boring, and I didn't really know what was happening. There's so many characters that I couldn't keep straight in my head. All the different pastors that were wandering around scheming in different people's living rooms. I was like, what is happening? I don't understand this story at all. Then once Caroline and Shirley were introduced, it did get a little bit better, and I started to kind of see where the plot was maybe going and found it more enjoyable. And then the last, probably third, from like 65% of the way on to the end, I really loved it, and I raced through that last portion. So I don't really know how I felt about it on a whole, because I did have such a different reaction to the different parts. I think I ended up giving it 3 stars on Goodreads, but like the first section was probably a 1 star for me, and the last section was like a 5 star, so I just averaged it out. But I did enjoy it, and I'm glad I read it because I do eventually want to read the whole Bronte canon. I just have The Professor and Villette left, so you know, that was part of what inspired me to keep pushing on, because I want to have read it eventually, so why not read it now? I do wish there was a TV adaptation of this. I think it would really suit that format. It was interesting to read this along with North and South at the same time, because they're both dealing with industrialization, with mill owners, with unrest from workers who are not happy with the way mill owners and mills are treating workers and industrializing in their areas. So Shirley is really dealing with this from the mill owner's perspective. We don't really get insight into how the workers felt except through the perspective of the mill owners. One of the main characters, Robert Moore, has a textile mill, and he's trying to install new, more mechanized looms, and the workers are unhappy that this would put people who have been working in this profession for a long time out of work. And so there's some civil unrest, some violence that happens against his mill, and the story kind of unfolds around him trying to protect his livelihood and the various upper class characters in the town that are on his side. So in that way, it was kind of an unbalanced portrayal of the issues of the time. So we are really only getting that one side of the story, so it would be interesting for me to try to find some Victorian literature written from the other perspective. Yeah, I don't want to say more because I'm going to spoil it, but I did find the ending very satisfying, and I'm glad I read it. I probably would never reread it, but it's definitely one that I'm happy to have crossed off of my, ultimate Victorian literature bucket list. And then the last book that I read was, I only got half of the way through, and that's North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell, so I'm finishing that off in November. And it was, like I said, it was kind of timely to read this together with Shirley because North and South has a slightly more nuanced perspective on these issues of industrialization and mills at the time, because obviously we have Mr. Thornton's perspective as a mill owner, but we also have Margaret, who befriends some of the working class people who are struggling to survive and who are employed by Mr. Thornton, so we get that perspective as well. So in that way, I found it more of a nuanced perspective, more of a balanced perspective, in giving us kind of both sides of the stories and showing us where both sides were coming from on these issues. And like I said, I only got about half of the way through, so I don't have a fully formed opinion yet on North and South, but I am really enjoying it. Elizabeth Gaskell's writing is so personal. You really feel like you're getting to know the characters, and they really feel like they aren't characters, they're people that you're just learning about their story. I say it's kind of like as if you're just looking into the windows on people's life in a non-creepy way, because it really does feel like real people that you're just observing them going about their day-to-day life. There's nothing over-characterized or fake about the characters that she writes. They really do feel like real people. So I am really enjoying that, and I'm happy to finally have gotten to it, and I'm excited to rewatch the miniseries whenever I finish reading the book. So that's all the books that I read for Victober. I hope you had a wonderful Victober if you participated, and until next time, enjoy wandering through the pages of a good book.